Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 13th, 2008. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, Chris Colby from Brew Your Own magazine joins us to give us tips on building our own Kegerator. Got an old fridge or freezer and want to give it a new, more fun life? Install some taps and gain instant popularity with family and friends. We also check in with Chris about the hop situation. Well, if you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And as always, you can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing. All one word. The 2009 Brewers Logbooks and the Introduction to Wine Kits DVDs are both here, new items. Many of you have already taken the opportunity to pick up the new items, and we appreciate that. Christmas is just around the corner, so don't wait too late. Figure if Walmart can already be doing Christmas shopping commercials, I can too, so there you go. And speaking of Christmas, if you do your Christmas shopping on Amazon.com, please don't forget to click on the Amazon associate link that we've got on basicbrewing.com before doing so. And we appreciate very, very much, as always, those who do keep us in mind. One quick note, Jeffrey T. over at the Good Beer Show has started up a new beer blog and has invited me along with many others, he says, to participate. It's called Beer Porn. And no, it's not what you think. Unless you think it's a bunch of folks talking lovingly about their favorite beverage. In that case, it is what you think. I don't know how often I'll post myself, but you can check out my first post, which is about brewing a little barley wine this past week, at beerporn.blogspot.com. beerporn.blogspot.com. Along with others that have already gotten on the ball, you can see my little article. And I don't have enough time to manage my own beer blog, but maybe I can make a contribution to the one that Jeffrey T. is starting. And you can't say no to Jeffrey T. He's Mr. Good Beer Show. I'm continuing to receive email on the topic of how we approach the subject of home brewing and a fondness of beer with our kids. How do we encourage our offspring to approach beer and alcohol with a positive attitude? I'm going to read one more round of letters on the topic, and then I promise to get off the soapbox or beer crate or whatever I'm standing on and get back to more traditional letters. These are just so interesting and good and valuable, I think, that I just wanted to share. And just like last week, I'm excerpting for brevity, so I hope I'm picking out the good parts. The first one comes from Kev in Australia. Kev says, I myself am a teacher. My kids know I'm a bit of a beer geek. I teach 10-year-olds. I always let my kids know when events like Oktoberfest begin or what a Märzen is, its significance to the festival, etc. I think it's important to let people and kids know about the fantastic history and culture which surrounds beer. Kev says, I thought I'd share a funny story with you, though. He says, the local priest at my school is a beer lover and often stops in to collect some discreetly packaged samples of a recent brew. About once a month, he arrives at my classroom with a carton of empty bottles for me to add to my collection. Always empty bottles, unfortunately. He arrives at my door with the carton and says in a loud voice, I have some more books for you. All the while, the bottles are clinking away in the box. Thanks, Father. I love books, is my response as I stash my carton under the desk. Kev says, I met with some parents recently who, after hearing the true story, reported that their kids were amazed at my love of books and how often the school's priest arrived with a new box of books. Thanks, Kev. Coincidentally, I discreetly trade homebrew for figs with the local Presbyterian minister. So there you go. Can't hurt, right? Drew in Seattle writes, as a recent college grad, most of the people I know who have learned to act like grown-ups around alcohol grew up with alcohol. It was present, open, and not something to be ashamed of. Drew says, my personal story is that of a kid whose parents are serious wine nerds. They not only were open with their love of rotting fruit, but they shared it with me and taught me. Starting when I was about 14, they made me drink wine, though only half a glass and only on special occasions. They did so whenever they had something really good, like a big red to go with roast beef on Christmas, so they could start to train my palate. Drew says, when I was finally of age, I had a tongue that could out-taste many people twice my age, and I got the joy of being the go-to guy for wine recommendations. A year ago, when I started homebrewing, I got the further joy of teaching my parents that a well-educated palate can find a lot of joy in beer, too. See there? You know, what goes around comes around. Drew says, it seems to me that we Americans accidentally demonize things we intend to moderate, and this is one instance where the middle road is most surely the best road. Thanks, Drew. This is from Jeff, a professional brewer in Singapore who is a former EMT, Navy corpsman, and police officer. And again, I'm paraphrasing here. Jeff has worked in arresting drunk drivers as a police officer, picking up their victims as an EMT, and now works as a brewer in producing alcohol. And Jeff says his approach with kids is to take the mystery and curiosity out of it, making it less desirable, as in the way he taught kids about guns as an officer. Jeff says, I always had my gun in a safe, but that also makes kids curious. Since the neighbors' kids were over a lot and the older daughters babysat from time to time, I got permission from their parents and brought them to the house. When they came over, my gun was sitting unloaded on the table, and they were all able to handle it and see how heavy it was. I took them to a range and let them watch me fire it. Demonstrated the destruction it's capable of doing on milk jugs and watermelons. They understood the dangers, they handled it, and learned that it wasn't a toy to point at each other if one was found anywhere. The curiosity was gone after that, and I never had a problem. Jeff says, with brewing, I have an 11-year-old son as well. The easiest and best thing I did was to have him brew with me at home and eventually at work. I explained to him the process and science behind it. I made it into a science class, and he enjoyed it. He samples the beers with me from chilled wort to finished product. He can smell a wheat beer from a mile away and knows that it comes mainly from the yeast. He knows the difference between lagers and ales. He thought it was gross when I told him that the alcohol, CO2, and other esters that the yeast produce are actually its excrement. Jeff says that kind of brought it home. He's trying to get the science teacher to let me help him make root beer for his science project. So what I'm saying is make it a life lesson, add some science to it, and then let them sample. Explain to them that it's about quality, not quantity. Thanks, Jeff. And one more from Jason in Los Gatos, California. As for what other people think, Jason says, the parents of my son's friends at preschool and my wife's mommy group know that I'm a home brewer, winemaker, jack of all trades, etc. They think it's a very neat hobby and are always interested to hear about it, and if the occasion is appropriate, try some. I've even inspired another father that's also been into making wine to get back into making beer, something that he hadn't done in years. Jason says, I believe the most important thing is to be a responsible role model to my children and anyone else that I interact with. It's okay to enjoy a drink, but always in moderation, and never drink and drive, something that we talk to the boys about. My older son even lets us know that we are not allowed to drive the car if he sees either my wife or I having a drink. And Jason says, luckily, we live close to a lot of friends and restaurants. Well, that's good. Being open and talking about what's good and safe and teaching your kids responsibility. Appreciate that, Jason. And along with everybody else who's contributed to the conversation. Good, healthy stuff, I think. I hope you do, too. Before we get into our interview with Chris Colby, I want to point out that Bob Taylor from up in Alaska, who you may remember was on this podcast teaching us about making sake, has an article in this month's Brew Your Own. Congratulations, Bob. And I have had the honor of sampling Bob's sake, and it's wonderful stuff. It really is. So be sure to check that out. and maybe you can make your own if you haven't been inspired already by his interview on this show. Now let's go to our interview with Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, where I started by asking about where we are in regards to the hop situation. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
James, thanks for having me.
We are going to talk about a couple of things this time, hops, and then how to build a kegerator. But let's start with the article that you wrote, which is an update on the hop harvest. You know, last year was a dire situation. Is this year any better?
This year is not really too much better. The last year there was some acreage, some hop acreage planted, but not a lot came from it. So the amount of hops produced by farms were, at least within the ballpark, and so this year we're still having a considerable hop shortage. Next year though, and then the year after that, looking into the crystal ball, things seem to point to some easing of the hop shortage.
And that's because it takes a couple years for hops to really get into production and producing the cones. It's not like planting a field of barley.
Right. The hops are perennial. They spring back every year from rhizomes in the ground. The first year that they're grown, most of the time, first year hops, hop farmers let them grow up and just cut them down at the end of the year, and it's treated as a year to establish a nice rhizome system. When hops are more scarce like they are now, it is possible that if you have a really good year to harvest up to 80% of the hop yield you would expect. So this year a lot of U.S. growers were hoping for that, but growing conditions really weren't that good. So basically, this was a year that a lot of new acreage got planted, a lot of hops got established, and next year, if even under an average year of growing conditions, we should start seeing the fruits of that.
Now, what is the mix of hops that were planted? I mean, you say in the article that most of it was high alpha hops.
Right. A lot of acres got planted. Over 10,000 acres, just barely, of hops got planted. Is that right? Yeah. But most of it was high alpha hops. Right now, with the shortage of hops, most big breweries are simply looking for alpha acids. They buy hop extract, which is a liquid extract of hops, and the variety of them doesn't matter because it's drowned out by whatever mix of hops get made into the extract, and all the varietal character is gone. So farmers really, since primarily they're serving the huge brewing conglomerates, are wanting to plant hops with a high alpha designation. So this year, if you look at the high alpha worldwide, about maybe close to 9,500 acres of high alpha were put in, close to 7,500 acres here in the U.S. alone. Whereas if you look at aroma worldwide, just short of 2,000 acres was put in. And in the United States, it was just short of 1,000, or actually slightly over 1,000. So, it's interesting. The U.S., which is not the biggest hop grower in the world, Germany is. We're the ones, though, that responded to the crisis by planting more acreage. Basically in the U.S., a lot of Columbus, Zeus, and Tomahawk, or CZT, or CTZ as they call it in the business, got planted. Summit, which is a high alpha variety, quite a bit of that got planted, and a lot of the other new high alpha varieties that also have good growing characteristics. Those got planted. On the aroma side, a lot of the new stuff was Cascades. A little bit of Autanum, Simcoe, and Centennial also got planted. But basically, what hop growers did, because it was in their economic interest, was to plant high yielding, high alpha hops, and that was the pattern last year too. Although less acreage was planted last year, and that'll probably be the pattern next year. Although I would hazard a guess that next year there'll be less acreage planted because they're probably pretty close to the break-even point right now on having enough hops to supply the hop product that people need. But yeah, definitely aroma hops are going to lag behind high alpha hops in returning to the stores and returning to availability.
So next year at harvest time, we'll probably be in lots better shape as far as the high alpha bittering hops, but maybe struggling a bit still on the interesting aroma hops.
That's sort of the best guess scenario. I mean, they're trying to figure out what happens to a commodity in the future is, obviously can be very hard, but a decent growing year next year where there's a lot of new high alpha hops planted here in the U.S. Those should come to fruition, yield a decent amount of hops and a decent alpha level. So, fingers crossed, 2009 harvest, our problems with just having, enough bittering hops available should be gone. And then in 2010, the craft industry is still growing. There's a demand for aroma hops, and a sort of nice thing about aroma hops is that a lot of the varieties of aroma hops develop a little bit faster than the high alpha ones, and then they're harvested earlier. So if you're a hop grower, when you plant a new variety, you have to consider that you've got your processing facility on site. You've got your hop pickers and your oasts, the buildings that dry the hops, and the machinery that leads up to that strips the hops from the vines and all that. And you can't plant, at a certain size facility, you can't plant any more hops if they're going to come due at the same time that all your other hops are. Mm-hmm. Because, the hops there's a very, literally I think it's only a couple days window where they're at their peak. And you've got to process them all right then. You can't just leave them hang on the vine, or you can't cut them down and just leave them in big piles somewhere. You've got to separate them from the vine and get them dried. So the nice thing about aroma hops is you can add aroma hop acreage and just plant varieties that are going to come due earlier than that, and you can just sort of stretch out your the season where you're operating your processing facility.
Cool.
So yeah, it's good for people who are interested in aroma hops, and it's also good for the farmers because they don't have to either build larger or new processing facilities. They just buy, or they'll, if the economic situation is such that they have the incentive to plant them, which they should, they'll be able to work that into their existing operation.
So it's positive news on the hop front. Let's move on to talking about kegerators. Now, I don't have a kegerator myself, mostly because I have very little self control. So, at least with bottling beer, I have to get up and go to the fridge and actually open another whole beer. So it's kind of like a decision of, do I want another whole beer? But with a kegerator, I've discovered, especially over at Andy's house, another half a beer is not such a big deal. And so, I think that for my own self-preservation, maybe a kegerator is not the best thing right now. Maybe in the future. But but let's talk about building a kegerator. And when we talk about a kegerator, it's essentially a mechanism, a device for storing, cooling, and dispensing your kegged beer, right?
Right. It's basically, something to keep the beer cold and a way to serve it. And, like you say, there's a real nice aspect of it is that you can sort of pour yourself however much or little beer that you want. One nice thing about, besides having a draft set up in your house is that if you have, if you have a kegerator and you have multiple beers on tap, if you want to have a couple ounces of 5 different beers rather than 2 or 3 whole beers or something, you can do that. And
that's true.
And of course, if you want to have a whole liter of 5 different beers, you can do that too.
But for those special occasions, like evening.
Yeah. Yeah. like the hours between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening.
Are there any downsides to having a kegerator?
Not particularly. I mean, you've got to spend a little bit of money up front to buy it. It costs money to run, just like a refrigerator. You've got to keep it maintained. You want to keep the draft lines clean, but basically, no. I mean, once you get past the upfront cost, it's just nothing but good. The way I look at it, at least.
That was one of the questions that came. I told my Twitter followers that I was going to talk to you about these subjects, and one of the questions was, how much does a system cost? How much does it cost to get into a kegerator?
That's a good question, because you can go sort of a lot of different ways. I mean, if you're starting completely from scratch and you bought all new stuff, there would be one answer to the question. But if if you're, I don't know, like me, and you already have a bunch of kegs, and all you'd really need to do is build the kegerator part, then it's a different answer. Basically the big, there's two big expenses with it. One is the kegging system itself. You need a keg, which isn't expensive, $35 usually for a used keg, but you need a CO2 tank and a regulator, and that's going to be more. And that depends on whether you buy a used tank or a new one. And then there's the fridge, and you've got, a couple considerations there. New fridges are going to run you at least a couple $100. Older fridges can be much less, including, if you find one on Craigslist for free where the person just wants you to cart it away. But then you also have the added little twist in there that the electrical efficiency of fridges, or the overall efficiency of fridges, has gone up dramatically in the not too distant past. So, buying a new one, there's more upfront cost, but your overall energy usage is going to be very low. To the point that literally even a free fridge is going to end up costing you more in a couple years, at least potentially, than just sucking it up and buying a newer model.
Yeah.
So there's, it would be nice to just give a flat, here's the cost, but you really have a lot of options in there. And depending on, if you're ranging from I'm going to go out today and buy a new system, you're looking at, at least several $100. If you're saying I'm going to scrounge one together from, garage sales and looking for fridges and people getting rid of their homebrew equipment, you can probably put one together for a lot less.
And one way you can do it is to ease into it. First of all, by getting into kegging and just, cooling your kegs, even with an ice bucket or whatever on the days that you want to serve it. And then just kind of easing into the thing that way. That way you're buying it a piece at a time. So there are ways to get into it economically.
Yeah, and definitely getting into kegging. A nice thing about homebrewing is it's really not that expensive of a hobby, But a kegerator sort of is the big, that's the leap that most homebrewers make, at some point, and end up putting some money into the system, is getting a kegging system and getting a kegerator or a refrigerator. And the thing is, though, when you talk to most people, I can't think of a single homebrewer who's ever told me, I wish I hadn't gone with this. I wish I'd stayed with bottling. You just never hear that. Ever, you'd think out of all the people who have done it, someone would say, oh, I like bottling better. But
so there is a big decision to make in the very beginning, and that is, do you go with a refrigerator or do you go with a freezer? And first of all, I guess you can rule out most upright freezers because of the way the coils are integrated into the shelving and such.
Yeah, those will work.
But you can get a deep freeze.
Chest freezer, yep.
But there is an issue in that you've got to make a hole through, to come from the inside to the outside at some point, and that's where it gets kind of tricky in some of these configurations. Right.
In a standard fridge, how you build a kegerator is and the construction is really simple once you buy the hardware, is basically you just drill a couple holes through it and have the shanks, and the beer lines come out through that. So in a fridge, you drill through the front door because there's no, there's no gas lines in there for the, the compressor and the all that. There's nothing there. So you're free to drill through there. If you're doing a chest freezer, there are coolant lines throughout all the sides, and so you can either, you have two options. You can either drill a hole in the top and put like a tower dispenser there, or you can build a collar where you just take 2x6s, make it the size of the size and shape of the chest freezer, and you unscrew the lid, put the collar on there, and then screw the lid into the top of the collar, and then drill your holes through the collar. So those are your three basic options for building a kegerator. In the BYO story, we did the version where it's an upright fridge and you just drill the holes through the door.
Now, if you build a collar for the deep freeze, do you lose some efficiency with the insulating properties of the side of the thing versus the wood that the collar is made out of?
You probably do a little bit. I mean, the people I've seen that built them have put insulation around the interface between the wood and the top of the chest freezer, and then the lid on the chest freezer, of course, will have that little rubber thing. I mean, in a 2x6, that's actually pretty good insulation, I would think. I mean, I don't have that set up, so I don't know, but I would guess that if you put your hand on the outside of it would feel more like room temperature than like inside a freezer. That's a question I don't know. I would suspect that it would preserve the coolness pretty good, though.
I don't know what the R factor is on a 2x6.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I would think it would be pretty good, but I certainly don't know that by any stretch of the imagination.
Now, there's another question before we get into the equipment list. Another question from Twitter is for those who haven't gotten into kegging, where do you get your stuff? I mean, what are the best resources to get started?
Most homebrew shops, kegging's not new. It's not something that's that esoteric, really. A lot of people get into homebrewing, do it, and most homebrew shops have kits to help you do it yourself. They'll have a starter kegging kit, which is the keg, one or two kegs, and a regulator and a gas tank and the required tubing and Cobra taps and stuff. And with that, all you need is fridge space essentially, and you can shove it in there. But most homebrew shops also will sell Kegerator refrigerator conversion kits, which are and you can probably either buy them with the startup kegger kit or just separately. And the conversion kit, refrigerator conversion kit, would just take the taps and the shanks, the stuff that you actually pour the beer from, and how they fit through the refrigerator wall, and the tubing and stuff like that. So this isn't building a home kegerator is not the kind of thing where you have to go search through the McMaster car catalog or go to some if you're not a real build it person, you don't have to go to Home Depot and figure out find all these weird parts or whatever. You can usually go to your homebrew store and they'll just have an assembled kit for you to use.
So what comes in a kit? I mean, what are all the bits and pieces that you got to put together to make this work?
Well, if you're talking about the conversion kit for making a refrigerator into a kegerator, that's basically going to be the faucets, the shanks, maybe the tap handles, although a lot of times they leave that for you to do. The beer line, the disconnects, clamps for the hoses, that kind of thing. And for the beginning kegging setup, it'll be one or two kegs, the CO2 bottle, the regulator, and there'll also be the tubing and stuff like that. So that would be pretty much what would come in something like that.
Now, but you mentioned the regulator. It's not just it takes a little education to balance your system correctly and to get it to where it's not just dispensing foam.
Right.
So, and we talked a little bit to Ray Daniels at the homebrewing conference about that, and how you can kind of figure out mathematically how much line to put in, what size line to put in, and all that. And I get questions every now and then of, I've got a kegging system, and now all I get is foam, and I just fill pitchers of foam and set them aside and wait for them to settle down so I can drink it. So there is, and you have a nice sidebar in this article on balancing your draft system, but go over the elements of that. How do you make sure that your system, what does it mean to have a balanced system, and how do you go about achieving that?
Right. That's a good question, and that's one that pretty much everyone who's ever started kegging has, in one way or other had to figure out. Basically when you have kegged beer, you've got beer, it should be cold, and it's under a certain amount of CO2 pressure, right? Because there's CO2 dissolved into it. Mm-hmm. And, in order to keep that amount of CO2 dissolved into it, there has to be CO2 pressure on the top of it. Because if you had a keg and you released all the pressure and then, left it sealed, what would happen was CO2 would bubble out of the beer and eventually sort of, repressurize the headspace, to a slightly lesser degree. And if you kept releasing the CO2 pressure, you'd eventually have flat beer and no gas pressure in the thing at all. So anyway, the beer's under pressure, and it also has carbon dioxide dissolved in it. And to get it to flow out to your beer glass, what you want to do is have enough resistance in the line leading from the keg to your dispenser, the tap, so that you have beer coming out at the right speed and without setting up the conditions where CO2 is going to break out of solution very easily and start foaming.
Because if you push it too hard, it's going to foam, and if you don't push it hard enough, it's going to foam.
Right. If you let's say you're keeping your beer at 10 psi, 10 pounds per square inch or whatever. If you would install, let's say you install 2 inches of beer line and then a Cobra tap, you open it up and the beer is just going to come out like a fire hose out of there.
Which can be fun, but not useful for beverage purposes. Right.
And, with typical diameter, small diameter, tubing, that's just not going to work. On the other hand, you can imagine if you kept putting longer and longer and longer bits of beer line, the longer it gets, the beer starts to flow, slightly slower. And certainly if the beer is going uphill, like a lot of times if you have a tower system, your kegs are below that, and then the beer is being pushed uphill. And certainly in a commercial operation, your kegs might be in the basement, and you have to maybe push the beer up a whole floor. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the longer the line you have, and the farther the vertical climb is, eventually you would get to a point where the pressure on the beer was not enough to get it out of the tap. So what you want to do is you want to shorten it, from that hypothetical point. You want to shorten it just enough so that the beer comes out at a nice rate. And basically that's the idea for balancing your draft system. And there are simple equations where you just basically you look at some estimate of how much resistance is there in beer lines, how much resistance are there. Sometimes they're also given individually for shanks and the taps and stuff, and how much resistance is there for climbs, pushing the beer up a vertical height, and you calculate how far it would be totally to completely cancel out the amount of psi that you've got your beer under, and then you shorten it just a little bit. And the thing about these things is they're nice. It's nice to you do a calculation and come up with a number, but you really have to realize that these are estimates. They hinge critically on do they have the amount of resistance right in your beer line. And when you look around, if you just Google it up and look around at different estimates, they vary wildly, like over 4 times. So for a kegerator, since it's the equations is simply multiplication, you're dealing with, you have a fourfold variance in the possibility of the, length of your beer line. So what we recommend is, do the calculation as a ballpark thing and then start out longer. I mean, I would say take that estimate and double it, set up your system that way. Tubing is cheap. Set up your system that way, see if it pours, and if it pours at a reasonable rate there, there's your solution. If you open up the tap and nothing comes out or just dribbles out, or, it comes out really slow and foamy, then, cut off a little length, hook it up again, try again, and just work down by trial and error to the solution.
And
so
the size of the hose is critical. For instance, Ray Daniels was saying that there's a tremendous amount of resistance difference between a 3/16 inch inside diameter hose, which is what he recommends, and a 1/4 inch. Even though that's only 1/16 of an inch difference, there's a tremendous amount of difference in the amount of hose that you need in order to balance that system.
Right. As the size of the hose goes up, the resistance drops pretty much exponentially, because it's a question of volume to surface area, and the amount of surface area, the amount of the hose touching the beer per volume of beer goes down drastically. 3/16 inch beer line is pretty standard. Certainly works very well in home kegging situations where you don't have to push it very far. And, it's rather than having, if you had 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch beer line, rather than buying, 30 or 40 feet of that and trying to wrap that inside your fridge, it's easier to have 10 foot of, 3/16 inch beer line and do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I mean, every system is different, and, and things like, how well it's cleaned. There's also the question of, when you do these calculations and look on your gauge, do you really know that if your regulator is what's the word I want here? Calibrated.
Yeah. It may not be calibrated. It may be.
Yeah, you don't know. So you can sort of check on that by if you dial in a certain pressure, and you say you're shooting for the typical level of an American pale ale, and from your table of beer pressures and temperatures, if you dial it there, and if it's too foamy, then you can probably infer, or too carbonated, you can probably infer, well, maybe my gauge is reading a little high, and if you dial in what should be the correct pressure and it seems flat, you can maybe say, well, it's too low. I mean, I think the average gauge is probably pretty close to right, but coming from a background in science and just knowing, anytime you have any instrument that's supposed to be measuring something, your first thought always needs to be, is this number that it's giving me, is it precise, is it accurate? And, just assuming that it isn't always the way to go.
And also, if you're trying to balance your system, it's probably important to only change one variable at a time. For instance, if you're getting foamy beer, you don't want to cut your tubing and increase the pressure on the regulator. Changing one thing at a time is probably the way to approach it, right? Right.
I'm just a big fan of realizing that tubing is cheap and working from there. If the first thing you should do, whenever you're kegging is find out a way to get your beer kegged to the level you want it. And, at fridge temperatures, most people store their beer at, between 8 and 12 psi, and that pretty much covers the range of carbonation levels that home brewers want. You can go outside of that if you need to push beer uphill a lot, or if you don't like a lot of carbonation or whatever. But that's, for a lot of people, that's going to be the range they cover. And once you get to the point where you're pouring beer, even if it's foamy initially or whatever, but if it's carbonated to the right level, then just buy a long length of tubing. Figure out, do the calculation if you want. Start a little longer than that, and just start with a long piece of tubing and whittle it down till you get there. It's just the most straightforward way to do it. It's it's economical. Even if you buy twice as much tubing as you need, tubing is still, I don't even know what it is for the foot anymore, but it's cheap. And it's just the calculations are nice, but think of them as a guideline, not this is the answer, end of story, because there's no, given all the different producers of beer line, and there's no way that they know exactly what the restriction is in your beer line versus another, and just different materials on the inside can be, or can have an effect.
And when you get your system, when you get your CO2 tank, once it runs out, you need to find somewhere locally where you can get it refilled. And is CO2 CO2? Does it matter what kind of carbon dioxide I get?
Most. There are a lot of outlets in the world that use CO2 to push beverages. Everywhere you go and there's a soda fountain, they use CO2. Every place you go and there's draft beer, they use CO2. So if you go to any place and tell them that this is for beer, they'll give you CO2 that you can use for that. I'm actually not really sure if there are two different kinds of CO2, like industrial, non-food grade or not. I just, whenever I go there, I just tell them it's for beer, and they nod, and they've, if the people who work at gas stores know what beer is. So, yeah, it's, there might be different grades, but if you just go in there and specify that you're using it for beer, you'll be fine. And I mean, I would guess even if you didn't, when somebody comes in with a 5-pound CO2 cylinder, they're going to guess what that's for. Or if they don't, they're going to take the safer, liability route and not give you something dangerous. But yeah, as to the best of my understanding, CO2 is just at the pressure that it's in a tank, it's just a liquid. At atmospheric pressure, it'd be a solid. But they pump it into those tanks, and I would sort of guess that they don't have two separate sources, but that's just a guess on my part.
Now, what about, we have another question from Twitter. How do you deal with condensation inside your kegerator?
That's a good question. A lot of places, in the U.S. are fairly humid. Where I live can be humid every once in a while. And if you have a kegerator, or even if you have like I do, I have a chest freezer that I use for fermentation. A lot of condensation can build up in there, and you don't want that because it's it's a breeding ground for mold or whatever. Besides the obvious, just wiping down excess water some of the time, the best solution is there's this stuff called damp rid, which it just comes in little tubs, and I believe it's just calcium chloride, but it's basically just very hygroscopic. You put it in a damp place, and it pulls oxygen, or not oxygen, it pulls moisture from the air, and you can just you put one of those tubs in there, and it lasts for quite a while until it turns sort of liquid, and then you can either go get a new one, or if you're ultra cheap, you can spread some tin foil or aluminum foil in your oven and just pour like the slurry on top of that and bake it until it's hard again, and then just crack it up with a hammer and put it back in there. Damper does a good job. With kegerators, given that you're serving at, you're going to be serving at sort of refrigerator temperatures, those usually don't have too much of a problem with condensation. When you get though to using like a chest freezer as a fermentation chamber, a little bit higher temperatures, you're a little bit more likely to get that kind of condensation in there.
And I've heard that other people use these little cordless dehumidifiers as well, these EvaDry devices. You can probably find other brand names, but that's the one that comes up every now and then in conversations. So there are probably other dehumidifier solutions out there to suck the moisture out of the air, but that's the problem. I mean, if you've got condensation, you've got moisture, you've got humidity inside there, and you need to get rid of it.
Yeah. I mean, one nice thing about a kegerator versus a sort of normal fridge is that most of the time the door is going to be closed. Like if you've got a normal beer fridge, you're going to be opening it every time you want a beer. With the kegerator, you're just coming up there and pouring the beer out of that. So I guess there's two elements of that. One is that you're not opening up the fridge to, the potentially moist air as often. But on the other hand, you maybe aren't checking it as often either. So, I don't know, from my personal experience with kegerators, which is, I actually don't have one. I've got a fridge and a chest freezer that I store kegs in, but I don't have the holes drilled through them. But other people's, I don't know. I don't see that in practice for most people, unless you live somewhere that's really humid. It's not like condensation is a constant ongoing battle. Just a little tub of damp ridge stuck in the back for, I would guess 99% of people should be more than enough to just, make that be a non-issue for you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard of those little electric dehumidifiers. That's a cool idea.
Now, once you get your system set up, you can customize it, and you've also got a couple of other articles in there on a fancy club. It's being called a club kegerator, which is basically a bar, and they have plans there, and you can show how to do multiple taps and such as that. And there's also a kegerator on wheels, which is a garbage can that's been that's been insulated and taps installed and such as that. So you can kind of use your imagination to take the concept and make your own kegerator out of existing stuff.
Yeah, that was our hope. I mean, we presented these three projects. The standard home kegerator story, which the project itself is drilling 2 holes and sticking the shanks through them, and that's basically it. But the story also goes into just the basics of what kind of pressures do you need, what kind of the balancing your system, and just all the basic kegging stuff in that one too. And then we also have the story on the club kegerator, which is the Carolina Brewmasters, the homebrew club down there. They built this big bar essentially that has 2 towers on each side. If you know what they are, the Irish coffin style towers, and they got 5 taps apiece on that, and then they have a big Randall sitting right in the middle, a hop infuser, and so they've got their little system built, and it's nice because it's portable as a huge bar like that can be. It folds all up, and all the pieces pull out, and it's just really nice. Like, it'd be a really good project for homebrew clubs, and certainly, I'm sure if you were building your own, you'd probably, you'd take these examples as an idea and go from them. But the planning drawings are all there in the article, so you can do that. And the other one, the rolling kegerators, is just a neat idea. The guy was just, as he tells in the beginning of the story, was just sort of walking through, hardware store or whatever, and he just saw one of those, big rolling garbage cans, and he thought, hey, I think I could fit some corny kegs in there.
You're a home brewer when.
Yeah.
You walk through the hardware store and say, I could put beer in that. I could ferment in that. I could keg from that.
Yeah, exactly. That's everywhere I go. It's like my view of everything is so warped by homebrewing. Like every time I walk through a grocery store, I'm always thinking, what could I ferment? That's like the main thing in my brain. Every time I'm at any kind of store, it's like, what could I adapt for homebrewing here?
One final tweet from Twitter, and it's kind of a word of warning, I guess. If you decide to enclose your kegerator, say if you want to build maybe like a wooden enclosure around your freezer or something, you want to make sure that you have some sort of ventilation for the compressor, I guess, because the compressor actually gets hot, and if you go all the way around, you're probably going to cause some problems with overheating. So that's probably good advice.
Yeah, and also where the coils are, you've got to let air flow past there. If you took a standard fridge or freezer and like built a case around it or whatever. You're trapping all the heat in there, and that's not going to work.
Yeah.
Can I say one other thing about the rolling kegerator?
You sure can.
The one neat thing I think about, or the neatest thing about this, is the CO2 system it uses. It's instead of having a full-size CO2 tank set up, he's got a setup that's actually used for paintballs, and it's, you've probably seen the little bitty, like 10-gram CO2 cylinders. They sell them at homebrew shops for dispensing a keg, but you need 3 of those to push a whole keg. This one uses a slightly bigger version. It's I guess they sell 9-ounce and 20-ounce cylinders. So those cylinders hold, quite a bit. They're almost, not quite, but they're almost the size of like a soda can. And he's got that inside there. So it's really, he's got enough to push beer through multiple kegs, but it's not taking up the same amount of room that like a 5-pound CO2 cylinder was.
Huh.
And I thought that was pretty cool because I just actually been quasi recently. I was down at San Antonio's homebrew, the Alamos Cerveza Fest, and they had a couple commercial brewers there, and they were pushing their beer with those kind of things.
Huh.
And it's a really neat sort of solution because it's for portable, taking your beer somewhere. It's much more compact. Like I don't know, any number of times I've drug along, the full 5-pound tank or 10-pound tank and a CO2 cylinder. And, that's quite a bit to lug around. Yeah. But you've got these little, paintball-sized ones, the bigger paintball-sized ones. And that's really kind of a neat idea and a neat little project just for, if your club throws a picnic every year or if you, are constantly being asked to bring homebrews to parties. It's nice to have a little, a portable, rugged kind of, dispenser.
And you can just drag it with you wherever you are in the house. So it sets up by the recliner, and then, when you go to dinner, you can drag it in there into the kitchen with you. And,
sure.
If you're working out in the garage, it goes there, out in the garden. Pretty much, I guess you could take it shopping if you wanted to. And you'd never be more than an arm's reach away from a beer.
Yeah, maybe in next year's, November, maybe we'll combine it with some of the robot technology that the Japanese are using, and this like this taperator following you around, a robot with a keg tap sticking out of the middle of its chest. More beer, sir.
And we'll leave it up to the listeners and readers to come up with a good name for that.
I saw somewhere online someone built a recreation of the robot Bender from Futurama.
Oh yeah,
and made him into a beer tap, which was pretty cool. I thought
appropriate. In one episode of Futurama, they actually made beer inside Bender. Did you see that one?
Oh, I missed that one. No.
Yeah,
awesome.
they did homebrew inside Bender. And it was like he was having a baby. It's like he was pregnant, and only it was with beer. He was with beer.
That's awesome.
Well, all right. Maybe I'm one step closer to investing in a kegging system and Kegerator and all that. I don't know. I'm a Luddite. I know that once I get into kegging, I'll love it, and I'll know that it was the right decision. I'm just, I don't know, stubborn and cheap.
I've got to build one for myself because I've got 2 years ago for Christmas, my wife gave me the tap and the setup for a nitrogen system.
Ooh.
So I've got, because I like dry stout a lot, and I've got this recipe that makes a nice sort of Murphy's esque dry stout that I make quite often, and so I've had the pieces for it for 2 years now, but I just haven't ever found like a weekend where I can go and essentially drill a hole.
So I'm cheap and you're lazy.
Yeah. I like to think of it as busy, but okay, lazy. I'll take that too.
You've only got two magazines to edit. What do you mean?
It's a balance between laziness and busyness.
Well, all right, Chris. Again, I appreciate your time. It's been fun.
Okay, thanks for having me on again.
Well, thanks again to Chris Colby. And if you click on the ad on basicbrewing.com, you can get a free issue of Brew Your Own magazine. And if you decide to subscribe after getting that issue, and you'd be nuts not to, you'll be helping to support this podcast. And as usual, thanks very much to everybody who's done that. Remember, we've got the Brewer's Logbook and our new Basic Winemaking Introduction to Wine Kits DVD out there on our online store. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And make sure that if you write to me, take me off of your spam list or put me into your good list or whatever. I've gotten some emails back from guys that have said, hey, you don't respond. And I've responded. It doesn't go back through. Make me a trusted person on your spam list, however that works. Check out our... That was a digression. Check out our low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD on basicbrewing.com, where you can see Steve do a single-step decoction mash, and follow me through lager fermentation, where I don't use a chest freezer. There are also our original DVDs, Introduction to Extract Homebrewing and Stepping into All Grain, and we got combo deals. You can also see a list of folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and maybe there's one in your area, in your neighborhood. You can just go get it there. But if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can feel free to order it on basicbrewingshop.com, and I will pack it up myself and send it to you. We got shirts, 6 colors now to choose from, including white, which is a color. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Coleman's 70-quart Extreme Cooler Blue. I could mash in that. And 8-ounce Snow Seal All-Season Leather Protectant. I don't know how I would brew with that. I'm sure there's some way. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. Oh, Christmas coming up. There's also an associate link to the Apple Store on the site, too. That's all, everybody, until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson, our buddy in Austin. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. Talk to you next time, everybody. So long.